Today we've got the man of the lectures. He's a PhD in sports physiology, professor in the strength and hypertrophy master's program. We're going to cover a lot of information today about recovery, training, quite a few concepts that seems to be a little bit profound.
It really comes down to what works for you and how better you can adhere to it.
I think you have a really good way to sort of grade analogies and give some such a simple understanding of questions. So let's see how it goes.
Thanks.
All right. So what makes someone to just define as being a beginner versus intermediate or advanced trainee or lifter?
Yeah, that's a good question. A lot of people would say it's just how many years you've lifted. I think that's a good answer. And then it's, 0 to 3, 3 to 6 or 7, and then 7 plus. Beginner, intermediate, advanced. I don't think it's the best answer. I think a slightly better answer is, what intervention is causing you reliable gains? What does it take from your end to get really, really good results? So it's kind of like if you grade people according to their scholarship, how good they are as far as being scholars. You can't say how many years of school someone's been through. People can get through a lot of years of school, not learn a whole lot, and not deepen their thinking. And so you really have to grade based on the depth of their thinking. So just the same way you'd have to grade on the depth of the training it requires to consistently make gains. So there's 3 grades here: beginner, intermediate, advanced. I would grade beginners as people who essentially can make really good, robust gains, sort of guaranteed improvements, with just following the very simple semblance of the basics and giving almost no thought to any particulars. Like, I go in the gym, I lift weights, I just put more weight on the bar, and then I get stronger, and everything's amazing. Okay, if you can say that for yourself and you haven't put much thought into it, you're a beginner, and it doesn't matter how many years you've lifted for. Some people have lifted for 5 or 10 years, and they're still beginners because they just make these gains. They just really have no idea what's going on. Great time, right? And sometimes that's the case. Unfortunately, a lot of these people are also personal trainers, and then they only know as much as beginners know, and they're trying to teach other people, and I'm sure you've seen that before, where a trainer's making a client do something, and you're like, what the hell, that guy doesn't know anything. And he's very muscular, or she's very muscular, and you're like, well, okay, I guess they really haven't passed their beginner stage yet because they just get their gains super easy. They haven't had to think about it. Intermediates, I would qualify as people who have reached their first serious plateau and have had to give some thought to getting a little bit more nitpicky on the basics. Like an intermediate is someone who got gains, not thinking about training much, just doing the simple stuff, and all of a sudden they didn't get gains for a while. And they had to take their training and analyze it a bit more and start checking off some boxes. Like, is there progressive overload? Is there fatigue management? Maybe I need to be a little bit more specific. So for example, just to illustrate, if you can do any leg exercises and your squats go up, you're a beginner. If you could just train my legs, and every time I squat once a month, my squat is bigger. If you have done leg presses and hack squats for a while and you test your squat and your squat's not up much or not at all, you're like, oh, gee, well, usually it just goes up no matter what I do. Now you're probably an intermediate where you probably have to work on your squat technique a little bit or squat more frequently to learn the neural patterns and get better at those. So there's definitely that situation. So that's an intermediate. Now, an advanced person is not a title you really want. It's a title you sort of end up earning. And it's in my conception, advanced is when you are, in order to get gains at all, you have to have a lot of the real detailed boxes checked in, right? So, for example, an advanced weightlifter needs probably an Eleiko rotating bar that's really smooth, needs an actual platform, and needs their weightlifting shoes and belt. If they don't have those things, it's not like they can get a good workout. Sometimes they can get no workout at all because they can't even turn the bar over. It'll screw up their shoulders because of the fact that it's just a regular gym bar. And you think, what? You can't use a regular gym bar? Like, nope. If somebody like Kaylor Woolham or some extreme deadlifter shows up to a regular commercial gym and he has to pull over 900 or 950 pounds, he's probably not going to do that with a regular bar. He needs a deadlift bar. And people are like, what the hell is a deadlift bar? For bodybuilders at the very extreme ends, to make their best gains, they have to have their machines, they have to have their pre-workout drink, and they have to time their meals, and they have to be on the supplements in order to make these consistent small gains at this point. Just going in, hitting up the back doesn't work anymore, just doesn't reliably produce gains. You can't not know how much weight you're lifting. You can't have no understanding of your preparedness status. Like, am I fatigued or not? When you're advanced, a lot of things need to line up for you to get any gains at all. So that's my conception of what beginner, intermediate, advanced is. And notice, you can be different things for different muscle groups. So for example, your biceps can be beginner biceps. For years, you're just like, oh, no matter what I do, they grow. Like, that's awesome. But your quads on the very same person can be intermediate, where like you have to think about it a little bit for them to grow. Otherwise, they don't just automatically get better. And then your chest on the same person can be advanced to where you have to, like, the stuff that works for your chest, and the stuff that doesn't. Someone's like, you should do incline bench. You're like, nope, that just irritates my shoulders and it doesn't stimulate my pecs. I need this particular brand of machine and this cable fly, and I know I can only train chest twice a week, and it's only the 4 sets. And if it's with 5 sets per exercise, I totally break. And if it's 3, it just doesn't do much. Now you're advanced. So it's different for every muscle, different for every person. What matters is, are you getting good gains? If you're not getting good gains, you need to think about your training more. Maybe that'll bump you into intermediate. Maybe that'll bump you to advanced. And at some point, you'll get to a place in physique development or strength or fat loss where in order to make further gains, you have to be advanced. And then you're sort of advanced all around, and hopefully you're pretty impressive. So that's the case.
A follow-up question for that one would be, you mentioned about progressive overloading. What does that really mean? A lot of people don't really understand what does that mean, and how does it look week after week, like if we put it into an application?
So progressive overloading can actually be described more simply as overloading. Overloading in sports science is a range of difficulty of training that is difficult enough to cause adaptations. And there's a range there because training in let's say for chest growth, you can do 5 sets of chest in a workout, 6 sets or 7 chest, and all of them get you growth. So the overload range begins at 5 sets of chest, and let's say maybe it ends at 7 or 8 sets of chest, above which you can't even recover. It's way too much, and the overload range is such a thing as too much, right? Like your overload on cheeseburgers starts at 1 cheeseburger, makes you happy, but it ends at 4 because 4 makes you very sad. So there's a range. Now, as you train, how much weight it takes for you to get the adaptations you want, how many sets it takes, how many times a week you have to train, can all progressively increase, because as the body gets better, it requires a little bit more of something to continue to get better still, right? What used to, if you're trying to learn Spanish, for example, if you're looking at little picture book and it's like dog, perro, and you're like, perro, dog, I know how to say it. And, after about a week, you know how to say all the pictures of the animals, and that is no longer overloading. It doesn't actually make you better at Spanish. Then you may want a picture book with 1,000 pictures of all kinds of animals and all bugs and this and that, and then you're on to the next level. And at some point, I think you're a native Spanish speaker, right? So what's overloading for you to learn better Spanish? You probably have to go to like Venezuela or something and take a university course where in traditional Latin American scholarship and writing literature, and you run into words and phrases that you've never seen. You're like, holy shit, I feel stupid in my own language. Are you even speaking Spanish? Right? That's the level of advancement you're on. So overload is something, it's a range, but it goes up and up and up over time. So the real question is, are the weights you're lifting heavy enough to cause good adaptations? The simplest answer, there's a lot of complicated answers. The simplest answer is, are you making gains? If you're making gains, you're in the overload range, right? If you're not making gains, maybe you're outside of the overload range. We could talk about a couple specific instances where you're outside of it. For example, weight on the bar. Are you making gains? No. And then you examine weight on the bar. And like you take the curl, you used to curl 10 pounds all the time, and it made you stronger. And now you're curling 10 pounds and you're like, this is easy. And you're like, well, heavy resistance means resistance. Like it has to be difficult for me to move. It just doesn't seem like I'm checking that box anymore. Because, I get tired. I do lots of reps. I do lots of sets. And it just doesn't seem like it's heavy enough anymore. We can even go to the literature and say, what's the weight range? But generally speaking, if you're not challenged by the weight, if you're just moving it around all crazy, you're probably not in that overload range. So it's time to raise the amount of weight. What about number of sets? Well, generally speaking, training should be fatiguing. And if you go to the gym and you do 1 set as a beginner and you're like, oh, that was really hard, it's probably overloading. But if you go as an advanced person or an intermediate, you do 1 set and you're like, okie doke, so I'm warmed up, I guess. and I leave, and then I don't make any gains. The weight's very heavy, but you're probably just not doing enough work. So maybe do some more sets, and then you're back into that overload range. And then for frequency, for example, you used to get great gains training once a week. Now, you used to get sore for like 5 days after each training session, but you've kept the training pretty similar. And now you're only sore for 2 days, and the rest of the week you sort of sit around and you're like, okay, not sore. I guess I shouldn't train still because I'm recovering, but you're really not. You're just killing time. So then overload frequency there needs to be elevated to 2 times a week, and all of a sudden you're making great gains again. So overload is about challenge, and if you're not feeling sufficiently challenged, you should probably be doing a little bit more of something, and that something depends on how far off the mark you are in any one of those things.
You have brought up quite a few terms that seem to be quite important when it comes to determining volume, the repetitions, how much you do actually go to work on hypertrophy or strength. And these are terms like MRV, or maximum recoverable volume, or MEV, minimum effective volume. What is the difference between these two, and what is the application of those?
Totally, yeah. So the minimum effective volume is the least amount of volume you can do and still make measurable gains over time. And it exists for everyone. So let's say you've been training for 5 years and you want bigger legs. And you're like, okay, if I do 1 working set of squats per week, but it's really hard, I'm going to get huge legs. That's just not true. Like 1 working set, 2 working sets, and even 3 or 4 working sets per week might be just enough to maintain the size of your legs. It's not enough to gain anything. You could do 1 working set of squats till the end of time, and your legs will get no better for 15 years. And you'll be like, okay, that was below my minimum effective volume. Think about it this way. The analogy is like, what amount of food makes you no longer hungry? Like, it's not just any amount of food. Like, can you imagine, like, you tell your friend, you're like, hey, I want to go to this party with you, but I'm really hungry. And she's like, oh, it's okay. She gives you a potato chip. She's like, here you go. You're like, okay, thank you, but can I have more chips? And she's like, no, but like, I'm giving you food. It's energy. It'll make you better. You're like, that's not enough, damn it. It's not enough. So there's a certain amount that we need enough training. Now, there's also maximum recoverable volume, much higher levels of volume. Every time you do training volume, it is stimulative, it is also disruptive, it is fatiguing. And at some point, that training volume, especially if you've done week after week after week, is so fatiguing, your recovery processes start to lag behind. And because they have to deal not only with the fatigue of every workout, but with a cumulative fatigue adding up over time. So what ends up happening is then you reach your maximum recoverable volume, and you basically, the discovery, you say, okay, if I train my quads with 20 sets of squats a week, just about every other week, I can't perform as well as I used to. I literally get weaker. I get under-recovered. Recovery is defined as return to past performance. I usually squat 200 pounds for sets of 10. If I do 20 sets of squats for like a week or two, I can't squat 200 pounds for sets of 10 anymore. I can only squat 180 for sets of 10. I'm just too beat up. So you say to yourself, okay, if I'm training this much and my body can't recover from it, is it a good idea for me to train this much chronically? One time, you can get an effect of what's called functional overreaching. You push your body a little bit past its limits, and then coming back, it recovers bigger and stronger, super compensates, and you get better than ever. But if you're always bashing your body in and just making it worse, I mean, you're literally just making it worse. So a real big key for training is to roughly know your own volume landmarks, of 2 of which are minimum effective volume and maximum recoverable, and just kind of know generally where they are. So you'd be like, okay, anything much less than 5 sets of squats or whatever quad work per week for me just doesn't make me cause any gains. I've tried it. I know it doesn't work. And then anything much over 20 sets of quads per week, it just beats me up. It's unsustainable. It's over my MRV. Any training program you try to use that is below 5 sets and above 20 is a stupid idea, because you can't do it. It's the same thing as trying to eat a meal to feel not hungry anymore, satisfied, but also not so full that you're popping, and being like, okay, I can't eat any more than 3 bags of chips until I get sick. And if I have as many as 15 chips when I'm average hungry, anything over 15 chips, I feel pretty good and I feel like I have energy. Anything under, I'm just hungrier and I'm more pissed. So if someone's like, hey, do you want some chips? You're like, yeah. They're like, do you want 4 bags? You should probably be like, that's too many. And if someone's like, do you want 1 chip? Like, no, that's too few. A lot of times we know how many chips we want, but we don't know how much training is between our MEV and our MRV. People just randomly go to the gym. They do the same exercises, same sets and reps. And they're like, I don't know it's not working. I'm not making any gains. And you ask them like, well, are you sure you're doing enough? And they're like, I don't know what enough is. Well, are you sure you're not doing too much? Like, well, I don't know what too much is. Enough is, are you making gains on the low end of things? And too much is, are you doing a ton and actually not progressing? Because if you're doing a ton and not progressing, it may be too much. Doing less is a good idea.
So answering that question, for example, how do you know if you're properly progressing, overloading enough, or you're doing enough? What if you feel you are sort of in the same level of the same technique over and over for a movement, or you know you have improved? Because sometimes you could be like, how you know you've gone to the gym, you've performed, and you do really well, but then you go in the next session and you feel like you actually sort of keeping in the same situation over and over. For example, doing a pull-up, you might go and try to do bodyweight pull-up and you do 6 reps one day and you, yes, I'm doing really well. And over time, let's say you go the next week and you sort of seem to not be able to do more than that. And you keep trying and trying and trying. Is that something that you're missing or you're doing wrong? Or what is the missing piece in there?
The missing piece is tracking progress more fine-tuned and tracking it over multiple sessions. Everyone has a bad session every now and again, or a super great session. We're like, I'm stronger, but maybe you just got really motivated, or maybe it's just a high energy day. Is consistent progress, consistent performance. Am I doing 6 pull-ups this week? Can I do 7 next week, 8 the week after, so on and so forth? That's the ticket to know if you're gaining, is if you're clearly gaining. If you're not clearly gaining, you have to wonder, like, am I getting stronger? If you have to ask, the answer is probably no. However, with pull-ups, especially in low reps like that, you could be getting stronger, but in small gradations, too small to measure with a full pull-up. So for example, if your lats got bigger and you got stronger and you used to be able to do 6 pull-ups, but now your lats are bigger and stronger, so much so that you can do 6.5 pull-ups. How many pull-ups can you do? Well, pull-ups are measured in integers, whole numbers. So you don't tell anybody you did a half a pull-up. That shit is embarrassing. So you say, I can still only do 6, but I got up a little further close to the bar. Nobody counts like that. So what you can do is twofold. First of all, you can put a weight belt on yourself doing pull-ups, put 1.25 kilo plate on there, and then do 6 pull-ups weighing a little bit more. And the next week, another 1.25 kilos, and again 6 pull-ups. So yeah, you're still doing 6 and 6 and 6. Some days you feel a little weaker, some 5. Some days a little stronger, you do 7. But after a couple of months of that, you're doing 7 or 8 pull-ups with 15 kilos on the thing. And then if you take the belt off, you're like, oh my God, I'm doing sets of 12. Holy crap. So making sure that you're measuring in a finely graded manner is probably a good idea. It's like if aliens were watching the Earth to see if we're advancing as a species, but the only thing they were measuring is like how much nano architecture we've built between the Earth and the Moon and all the other planets, like physical machines that span solar systems. They'd be like, looks like the humans have done nothing and still nothing, and there's 0 advancement, and we don't see any nano machines, so nothing. Well, we're making huge strides, right? They're just not looking close enough. A lot of people measure in like these huge increments, like, can I add a pull-up? Look, a pull-up when you can only do 5 or 6. Holy shit, that's such a big gain. Maybe do the little weight belt, maybe get on the row, get on the lat pull down where you can use smaller increments, do some higher rep sets of 10 to 20. You will see great progress. Later, when you come back to pull-ups and you relearn the movement, you're going to be doing sets of 8, 7, 9 in no time, and then all of a sudden, voila, progress did occur. But I will say one thing really quick. Don't kid yourself. Yes, measure with small increments, but you have to objectively measure. Even in hypertrophy training, people will say things like, my technique's been pretty much the same for hack squats, and I haven't gained strength in the last 6 months on a hack squat, like for reps. I think my quads are bigger. Get out of here. No, they're not. You're almost certainly kidding yourself. Objective measures are very important. If your technique on a hack squat's been really similar, and you've put 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 pounds in your hack squat in the last 6 months, you can be sure, or pretty close to sure, has suspicion at least, that your quads are getting bigger. Because where the hell is that strength coming from? Yeah, the nervous system helps. But after a while, the nervous system is pretty much the same. It's only muscle size that can make the change. So for people in hypertrophy training, make sure your input is objective so that you're not joking to yourself about, am I making progress? You're watching these small increments and you're putting more increments onto the bar, not just being like, oh, my hack squat's not going up. Try a little bit more. Keep the reps the same. Add a 1.25 kilos. Add 2.5 kilos. every week, every other week, deload when you're tired, and then sort of come up, and then decline, come up, and decline. Eventually, those peaks should be the highest ever if your training is proper.
Awesome. Now I've got a question for you in terms of fatigue, and how much fatigue is too much? How do you know that you're training enough or you're training too much, or if you're resting too much or enough?
Totally. So the resting is a frequency answer. I'll get to that in a second. But the first answer is actually the same as the one I just gave. If you're training and your performance is still improving, you're not overly fatigued. And it doesn't matter how tired you feel, for the most part, because training is supposed to be hard. So people will say shit like this to me. They'll say, I think I need a deload. And I'm like, oh, your performance has dropped or plateaued? They're like, no, I get stronger every week. I'm like, so why do you think you need a deload? They're like, well, I feel tired. Well, guess what? Training is supposed to make you tired. That's a part of the process. You're still making gains by definition. Your fatigue is not excessive. You are still literally recovering, so you're good to go. Right? Training is supposed to be tough. We're not just supposed to pull back when we're tired. We're supposed to pull back when we can no longer make gains because our fatigue is so high. So over the long term, weeks, the way you tell if your fatigue is too high is if you stop being able to improve your performance, and it goes like this. That's when you pull back, okay? As far as frequency, if you're no longer sore and you are strong enough to hit a little bit of an improved performance from the last session, it's time to go back to the gym. So for example, let's say you train your chest and you're like, all right, I got to wait to train it again. Smart. Let's say it's Monday, you train your chest. Tuesday, it's tender to the touch and you feel a little bit weak. Don't train it because it's not recovered yet. Wednesday, let's say it feels perfect. It's not tender to the touch and you feel really strong. You're like, ooh, I could go and bench press again and I'll hit a PR. I know I will. Probably a good time to train. Thursday, you didn't go train Wednesday. Thursday, your chest feels, it's just completely healed and you feel super strong. Probably time to go. Friday, your chest, like you don't even remember. You're like, was I last sore? Was that Tuesday? Or I don't even know. And you're really ready to train and you're kind of like, I don't even know what's training bench. I'm forgetting what's going on. You're probably waiting too long. So as soon as you're not sore anymore and you feel ready to perform at your best again, it's time to go back. And that can be different for different muscles. Sometimes people have big muscles that are really strong and they take longer to recover. Your legs, your quads can be in a situation where every 3 or 4 days they heal and no sooner. Your biceps, your side delts can recover every day or every other day just fine. And there's no reason you shouldn't train some muscles more often because of that.
So when you talk about stimulus to fatigue ratio, how is that important in context of exercise selection?
Yeah. So every exercise will stimulate some muscle growth and every exercise will cause some fatigue. But not all exercises are created equal in that regard. So for example, if you are doing super wide stance squats, halfway down with a ton of weight, you're rounding your back a whole lot. How much stimulus is that to your quads? Well, we can kind of measure it by proxy. Are your quads feeling tension through them, okay, when you're doing it? No, not really. You just feel it in your back and in your inner thighs, okay? No check mark there. For higher reps, do you feel a burn in your quads? Because that means they're producing metabolites, they're actually active. No, I get a burn in my lower back, okay? No good. What about a pump? After a couple of sets, do I get pumped in my quads? It's a pretty good sign that something's going on there. Nope, no pump in the quads. You get pump in my lower back, some in my glutes, some in my inner thighs. Okay, no good. And then what about the next day? Where do my quads actually, right after the session, walking down the stairs, is it hard to bend my knees? Well, no, actually, my knees feel fine, but my lower back kind of hurts a little bit, and my glutes are sort of pumped. And then later, where do I get sore? Like, am I sore in my quads? Like, you did quads with a really good exercise. The next day, you should be moving your legs around and going, holy crap, my quads are hit up. But if only your lower back hurts and a little bit of your inner thighs and your quads feel completely fine, I mean, it's just probably not true that your quads got stimulated a whole lot. So that's the stimulus side. The fatigue side is how tired did the exercise make you for other unrelated exercises? So like if you do a couple sets of leg extensions, you feel pretty good everywhere else. Your quads are messed up, but everywhere else you feel fine. If you do a couple sets of super heavy wide stance sumo squats, you just feel wrecked all over because you just lifted hundreds of kilos and you're like, oh, I don't even want to do anything else. So that's going to be a high fatigue systemically. Another one is rating of perceived exertion, which also causes systemic fatigue. How difficult is that exercise to do psychologically? A really, really heavy partial squat takes everything out of you. A leg extension, not nearly as much, right? So it's a different level of RPE. And then lastly is joint and connective tissue stress. If you do a leg extension properly, how much does it really mess up your knees, mess up your hips? Like probably not much, maybe not at all or hardly. You have to do tons and tons of sets to get any kind of knee discomfort. What about a wide stance round back sumo squat? Good God, your lower back's going to be hurting for days afterwards and not in a good way. So all of a sudden, it looks like your exercise selection to use for quads, this wide stance round back sumo squat, the stimulus checklist was really poor. And then the fatigue checklist was really high. The stimulus to fatigue ratio for the quads, not amazing. Choose another exercise like leg extensions, high bar squats, hack squats, properly done leg presses. The stimulus is massive and the fatigue is not nearly so. So if you're asking yourself, what exercise should I choose for quad hypertrophy? Well, the answer is pretty apparent. It's probably not those wide stance squats, and it's much more likely to be those other exercises that have a better stimulus to fatigue ratio. Doesn't just work for quads, it works for everything else. So any other muscle group you use, any other exercise you use, even different techniques between different exercises, see how much tension they are causing you to feel in the target muscle, how much of a burn in the target muscle, how much of a pump with a few number of sets, and how much local fatigue, disruption, and perturbation they cause in the muscle. Those are all good things. And how much systemic fatigue they cause as far as how much they reduce your ability to perform other exercises, how difficult they are psychologically, and how much joint and connective tissue stress they cause. If all of those things, the stimulus is high and the fatigue is low, you got a winning exercise there, and those are the exercises you should be spending most of your time doing.
You mentioned something that is very interesting, and is about in understanding or trying to identify what's the difference between systemic fatigue, or is a physical fatigue overall, specifically in certain part of your body, or whether it's more like a psychological fatigue. How do you define or like differentiate when you go to train and like you probably feel like you have energy, you are not as tired, but like emotionally or psychologically you're drained because of stress or something like that. So how do you differentiate those three things?
Well, I have a real clever answer for you. True systemic fatigue integrates every part of your system, and psychology is a part of your system. So if you spent the last 4 hours fighting with your boyfriend and you come to the gym and you feel totally drained, you do have a high level of systemic fatigue. The source of it is psychological, but the effect is nonetheless the same. That is going to result in a decline of performance. It's probably not anabolic. It's probably going to cost you some muscle gain potential, and it's not a good state of affairs. So we want to seek to reduce fatigue from all sources and make sure that we're not just zoning in on one. So it's not so much to say, like, let's say you're an elite athlete and you're like, oh, you know, my workouts, I'm recovering from them great. I fight with my boyfriend all the time and it drives me crazy and I miss sleep. But that's okay. That has nothing to do with sport. Oh, it has everything to do with sport. It will cost your sporting abilities. So systemic fatigue is the sum of all fatigue, which includes local fatigue that comes from muscle damage, comes from cytokines, comes from disruption of the local nervous system, the peripheral nervous system, there's central nervous system disruption, all kinds of different stuff. All of that summates into the total fatigue, the systemic fatigue. So if you're saying to yourself, oh, I'm feeling really tired today, you are experiencing a high level of systemic fatigue. Now, it can be more transient if it's not training related. So if you have trained yourself for weeks and weeks and weeks, you've accumulated tons of fatigue, some of that systemic fatigue can take like a week to decline. But if you just feel tired because you were emotionally, like, let's say your boss really yelled at you at work for an hour and you're like, ugh, the next, he could send you a text message later that day, you're super drained, actually high systemic fatigue, but psychological systemic fatigue can be very variable. It can decline very rapidly and it can escalate very rapidly, unlike training related fatigue or training caused fatigue. If your boss sends you a text message later that day and says, hey, listen, like, I'm just going through a lot of stuff at home. Honestly, you're my best employee. By the way, I didn't want to tell you this yet, but you're getting a promotion next week. I didn't mean to yell at you. You're doing everything right. It was my bad. I'm taking you out to lunch tomorrow. You're great. All of a sudden, the fatigue is going to fall off really quick because it's psychological in nature. That is not to say that psychological fatigue is not important. It is super important. It is part of the systemic fatigue situation.
Okay, interesting. All right. So when do you recommend to do a complete rest, or whether it's better to do like more a active rest?
Yeah. Athletes should almost always be doing active rest because it heals you faster, it heals you more completely, and it retains your fitness qualities better. Active rest is also often misunderstood as you still have to train. You don't actually have to do any train. You just have to go and take walks every now and again and not just sit on the couch. Active rest doesn't mean a high level of activity. It actually means a low level of activity, but nonetheless activity. Play a little bit of pickup sports, walk your dog, play with your kids, stuff like that is totally fine. It's the sort of balance of life that's really fun and really low level of activity that is psychologically very rewarding and actually physically recovers you probably the best. That's what active rest really is. It's like living like a normal person. The exceptions to that are in the very short term. So if we're programming a 2-week active rest phase for an athlete, in the first couple of days, when they're super beat up from training, is it okay for them to just eat tons of food and sit on the couch and watch Netflix? Absolutely. And they say, oh, but I'm not being active. That's okay. You can recover a little bit until you feel a little better. And look, we all know this. There's only so many days you can sit on the couch and watch Netflix and eat potato chips and cheeseburgers. After a while, you're just like, man, I got to move. What's that called? Cabin fever, right? You could just like, I got to get out and do stuff. Then your passive rest has transitioned to active rest. Thing is, nobody really needs 2 weeks of passive rest unless you're injured or something like that. That would be the big exception. So most people need active rest, but parts of that active rest window that lasts 2 weeks can very much be just sitting around watching Netflix and being a piece of crap, because we're all entitled to that at least a couple times a year.
Awesome. Autoregulation versus pre-planned fatigue management strategies. Which one is best, or what's the difference between them?
Yeah, so there's no versus, it's both, right? Autoregulation is really great as a modifier, but based on you knowing your body from many, many cycles, you can do pre-planning to make sure that you're on track and you roughly know when you're going to have to deload and do other things like that. So you think, okay, the last 4 mesocycles that I did, I managed, 4 to 5 weeks of accumulation until I needed a deload. Like, if I planned my vacation that I'm taking, where I'm going to be deloading for sure, on the 5th week, I'm probably not making a mistake, right? Like, not a huge mistake. Now, if I planned it on the 3rd week, that'd be stupid, because you'd be like, it's okay, autoregulation. Like, yeah, but you know how hard I'd have to train for 2 weeks to earn a deload in the 3rd? That'd be nuts. So there's some pre-planning going on. Now, how about this? You plan your vacation on the 5th week, but you end your 3rd week, and you're like, honestly, at this rate, I can go for another 2 weeks. Well, you won't be able to train where you're going on vacation, at least not seriously. Then what you end up doing is you say, okay, this next week, I'm going to up the ante a little bit more than usual. You do a couple more sets, reps real close to failure, grind it out, and all of a sudden at the end of that 4th week, you're super beat up because you knew that you had a pre-planned vacation. You auto-regulated to increase the volume a little bit to make sure you're well cooked at the end of that 4th week and you've earned your deload, so to speak, and then you're good to go. So auto-regulation and pre-planned strategies are not versus. They're best friends, and they hold hands together and they smile and giggle. One of them has a crush on the other one, but you can't tell them because of this crazy family ordeal. It's 18th century imperial Japan. I'm just kidding. I have no idea where I am in space. I'm cutting so deep my brain doesn't work anymore. On a serious note, though, it's always a synergy between the two. Always a synergy. I think a lot of people are looking for just one answer, and it doesn't exist.
I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you have any questions or any comments, please comment below, and I'll be sure I'll answer to this as soon as I can.
That level. The hungrier and the more cravey you get, the lower hedonic foods you should be eating, and the more you're having trouble eating. A lot of bodybuilders gaining mass try to gain it on broccoli and brown rice and bland chicken. Stupidest shit I've ever heard, because you're just going to make your life miserable for no reason. You could be flavoring your foods, spicing up your foods, having some cheat meals now and again. You make amazing gains, and you'll have no downsides, but your life will be happier.